In prayer. Holy and loving God, we come before you with hearts that are heavy from the violence and division we see in this world. News of hatred, of lives lost. And yet, even in the shadows, you give us a glimpse of light. Today we give thanks for the gift of children, those who remind us that hope is never gone, that innocence and joy can still lead us forward. In their laughter, we hear the promise of peace. In their questions, we hear the invitation to seek wisdom. In their love, we see your Spirit breaking through. So, God of unity and God of peace, gather us as one people. Heal the wounds of our nation, calm our fears, and help us to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over division, and hope over despair. Bless the words that we are about to hear, that they may stir us to become peacemakers, bridge builders, and bearers of hope for a world that you so desperately love. Amen. Well, we're continuing our preaching series on the modern parables, but we're doing a little twist this time. We're going to actually look at a bunch of different birth narratives from the Bible. And then after we look at these different birth narratives, then we're going to look at a modern parable of a modern birth narrative story. All the scriptures we're going to be looking at today are listed in your bulletin. We're not going to read all those scriptures, or that would be the whole sermon if I did that. But I'm just going to recap what's going on in each one of those scriptures. The first one is the first miracle birth is going to be the birth of Isaac. I mean, imagine the story. Imagine Abraham at 100 years old, Sarah at 90, long past the age of cradles and lullabies. Yet God whispered a promise of life where biology had closed its door. Sarah even laughed at the absurdity, and yet laughter of disbelief became laughter of joy when Isaac was finally born. His name means he laughs, and it's a reminder of God's promise and how it can break through any impossibility. Now we turn our attention to the birth of Samuel. Hannah's story is one of tears that turned into hope. She poured her heart out at the temple, desperate for a child, vowing that if God blessed her with a child, she would give it back to God in service. Out of anguish came Samuel, whose name means heard by God. And indeed, Samuel became a prophet who would anoint kings and reshape Israel's future. Next, let's look at the birth of Mary, the mother of Jesus, a story we don't often hear about in church because it's not in the Bible, but it is in the Quran. And in the Quran, it talks about the birth of Mary. Her mother, Hannah, prays for a child and promises to dedicate this child to God. To her surprise, she bears a daughter. Her name was Mary. And she's raised in the temple and provided for in miraculous ways throughout her life. The Gospel of James, which is a gospel we have that's not in the Bible, tells a similar story to what we see in the Quran about the birth of Mary. And of course, I don't know if you've heard this one, the birth of Jesus. You guys know that one? So Mary, still a virgin, visited by an angel. She bore her son, the Spirit of God. And it was all done in Bethlehem in humble settings. Divine becomes flesh. God is with us, Emmanuel. A humble birth. A birth that redefined history. Now, there are some common themes that go through all of these birth narrative stories. The first common theme is the birth of a newborn baby brings with it a sign of hope for the future. Or I guess you could say the hope of deliverance, right? It goes through. See how we picked the song? Second, this hope is always brought into the world through a woman. So we just need to keep that in mind. So these women of the Bible oftentimes get second-rate stories. Stories aren't often told, but it's them who always brings this joy of hope into the world and changes history. This brings us to our modern parable today. This modern parable is called The Birth of Light in Apartment 3B. It was a bitter January night when Maya went into labor. Snow fell thick, silent sheets outside of the faded brick building where she lived. Apartment 3B. The heat barely worked. The fridge was mostly empty. And the world outside felt cold in more ways than one. Maya was 22 years old, alone, no partner. Her parents had stopped speaking to her when she refused to give this baby up for adoption. "You'll ruin your life," she said. "You'll be stuck." She'd been stuck already, stuck in cycles of shame and whispered rumors at the gas station where she worked, and side-eyed glances from church ladies who preached purity louder than grace. But that night, something shifted. Her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, a retired nurse, heard the cries coming from down the hall, and she came running. Together, they turned Maya's tiny living room into a birthing room. No doctor, no monitors, just grit, sweat, and whispered prayers. Then, after hours of labor, under the flickering kitchen light, he arrived. Micah, just 6 pounds, and covered in life, and crying like he meant it. Maya held him to her chest and wept. She didn't weep from the pain. It was something else, something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. Not the gossip, not the empty bank account, not the fact that she'd have to return to work in just a week and figure out how she's going to do childcare. She didn't care about the way the world keeps turning while people fall through the cracks. What mattered in that moment was the warmth of the wiggling body in her arms, the tiny hand that wrapped around her finger, the heartbeat against her chest that beated like a sacred drum. Mrs. Alvarez sat beside her, wiping sweat from Maya's brow and humming a Spanish lullaby. She looked down at the baby and whispered, "This world is a mess, yes, but God still sends us lights." Micah's name, Maya had read once, meant God, who is like God. She hadn't planned this to be a theological statement by any means. But now it felt like some kind of a holy declaration. He was born into struggle, but not into despair. He didn't erase her pain, but he gave it purpose. He didn't change the world overnight, but he changed hers. In the months to come, neighbors would drop off diapers and casseroles. Old friendships were mended. And every morning, Maya woke up to that same cry, loud, insistent, full of life. And she remembered. Hope doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a blanket or in a hospital wearing a bracelet and a tiny blue hat. Just like Isaac, just like Samuel, just like Mary, just like Jesus, Micah was a sign that God still makes a way where there doesn't seem to be one. That new life still breaks in where we least expect it. And that eve, in the coldest of January nights, hope is still being born. When I think about these miraculous beginnings of all these stories, old and new, Isaac, Samuel, Mary, Jesus, I I can't help but to look right here at Windermere Union Church and think about our children just across the way in the building. Because our children are not just joy to us, they are living signs of hope for the future of this church. They are the living parables among us. That's why when all churches, including this one, writes their profile when they're looking for a new pastor, every single profile out there says, we want a pastor who's going to bring in young families with young children. I don't think there's a church profile out there that doesn't ask that of a pastor. That's because all these other churches know what we know and what you knew when you wrote the profile. Children bring hope. But after COVID, hope was in short supply, not just for this churches, but for thousands of churches across the country. They all shrank during COVID. Families just simply stopped coming. Sanctuaries felt emptier. And the light of hope just flickered. And in some places, that light of hope nearly went out. But here in this little church, the flame was tended. And the faint flicker of hope that still remained was tended by people at this church. And much of that was actually attributed to one of our saints who really tended to the children who bring hope into this church. You may not know her by her full name, or especially some of your visitors probably don't even know her full real name. We just know her as Miss Chris. Miss Chris refused to let that little flicker of light die out. When COVID closed the doors of this church, she kept telling the story. She never stopped telling the story. She just put them online. Little ones could still hear about the love of God throughout COVID. She still does this to this day. She didn't stop doing that when COVID ended. She still posts those stories. When only one or two children wandered up to the stage for Children's Moment, Miss Chris was there for just one or two. Sometimes, Miss Chris was telling a children's story to an empty step. No children at all. But she was still there telling the stories, knowing that one day these stories would find ears once again. And they did. The perseverance created a foundation for future growth. And first it was her and Ann Meyer faithfully at her side, together caring for the few children we had when we had children. Then the children's ministry slowly began to grow, and the church realized we needed even more help. We brought Rochelle on board early in my pastorate here. And now, surrounded by both Ann and Rochelle, Miss Chris was now more equipped to strengthen and grow our children's ministry even further. And more children did come. Hope began to be rekindled. And with more teachers and additional parents helping out, Miss Chris could better care for children of all ages, dividing into different classrooms and doing all kinds of spectacular activities, making sure every child knew they belonged. And then, through a generous gift from our preschool, we were able to hire Megan as our new youth and children's minister. What was once just a flicker now became a fire. We've witnessed before our very eyes the birth of a vital program for our children and youth, something with multiple layers guiding the program throughout the church. From Miss Chris, who faithfully carried that flame of hope when it seemed so dim, to Megan, whose energy and new ideas come into the church and now fan the flame that Chris once held into something bright and blazing. We are seeing God's promise fulfilled before our very eyes in real time. Together, they are shaping not only a program, but they are shaping a vision. And today, hope is not just alive in this church. Hope is now raging like a wildfire. Hope. That's the thread that runs through every story that we've heard today. Isaac, born to the laughter of Sarah of disbelief. Samuel, who was born to a mother's desperate prayer. Mary, who was born to a special calling from God. Jesus was born to change the world through humility and love. Even Maya in apartment 3B, holding her little child Micah. As fragile as that may be, it was still a fierce sign that God breaks into our darkest times. And right here at Windermere Union Church, Miss Chris and our children remind us, hope is not a relic of the Bible. Hope is alive and moving in this church, and it's being born among us day by day. And let's be honest, with all this talk of hope, life is not easy. Some of us sit here today carrying incredibly heavy burdens. Some feel the ache of prayers that have gone unanswered. Some wonder if hope is just quietly slipping from their grasp. But the message of Scripture today, the message of Maya's story, of Miss Chris's faithfulness, the message is this: hope does not need perfect circumstances to thrive. We need to trust that hope is stubborn. Hope shows up when the odds are against it. Hope is born in hospital rooms and cold apartments alike, in barren wombs and in empty sanctuaries. Hope shows up when no one is watching, because God is always watching. And the truth is this: God is still writing new beginnings in your life, in my life, in the church, in the world around us. So if you are weary, hear this: hope is closer than you think. If you are grieving, hear this: new life is still possible. If you are doubting, hear this: God has a way of turning even our laughter of disbelief into laughter of joy. And may we, all of us, like Miss Chris, hold the flame faithfully until the day comes when the wildfire of hope takes over. It blazes again in ways we could have never imagined.